Good evening. My name is Jo Burke, and I am the program director for the Northern Illinois University Art Museum. I want to welcome our speakers and all those members of the audience who are joining us online. Congratulate you for getting to us. We were having some link issues earlier. Tonight's presentation is one in a series developed by our former coordinator of marketing and education, Stuart Henn, in conjunction with the Refuge and Refugee exhibition currently on view at the museum, along with The Art of Surviving, the Journey of the Karen Refugees in Illinois. Both shows are running through November 12th. The exhibitions and programs of the NIU Art Museum are sponsored in part by the Illinois Arts Council, the Friends of the NIU Art Museum, the NIU Arts and Culture Fee, and the College of Visual and Performing Arts season presenting sponsor, Shaw Media. Tonight's panel discussion is being recorded so that you may share it or watch it again. It will be captioned and posted later to the College of Visual and Performing Arts YouTube channel, accessible from the museum's website. I will attempt to monitor the chat function for questions and feedback. We will also hold a Q&A at the end of the discussion. It is my honor to introduce our guest moderator this evening, Board of Trustees, Professor and Distinguished Research Professor of the NIU Department of History, Heidi Fehrenbach. Professor Fahrenbach's teaching interests cover modern European history, social and cultural history of world wars, modern Germany, race and ethnicity and transnational perspective, human rights and humanitarianism, film and photography, history of children and childhood. She is the recipient of research fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the American Academy in Berlin, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Deutscher Akademischer Ausdrucksdienst, and the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis. Prior to coming to NIU, she held tenured positions at Emory University and Colgate University. Professor Fehrenbach is co-author, along with David Rodonho, of Humanitarian Photography, a History, published by Cambridge University in their series, Human Rights in History. In this and other publications, she has written of the imagery and depiction of refugees, particularly women and children, in prompting a humanitarian response for those in need. Tonight, she will be speaking with two of the artists in Refuge and Refugee, Yolanda Delamo and Eddy Lopez, in a discussion entitled Representing Refugee Experience, What's at Stake. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heidi Fehrenbach.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josephine, for that introduction. And thanks to the NIU Art Museum for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure to participate in this event and something that's kind of out of my wheelhouse. So I hope I do it justice. So I would like to introduce the two artists that we're going to be speaking with tonight. Yolanda Delamo and Eddy Lopez. Yolanda Delamo is a photographer who is based in New York City. She was born in Spain. She attended the University of Cologne in Germany studying mathematics. And I think that's a discussion for another time. She'll find out how she got from math to photography. In any case, she finally made her way to the United States and wound up studying and receiving her Master of Fine Arts in photography at RISD, at the Rhode Island School of Design. Excuse me. Her photography has been the focus of sole exhibitions in Havana, Cuba, and in the United States at museums and cultural centers and galleries, such as the Hudson Franklin Gallery in New York City and the Lightwork Gallery in Syracuse, New York. She has, in fact, a forthcoming monograph of her work titled Archipelago, that includes an essay by the renowned historian of photography and critic of his photography, Vicky Goldberg. Yolanda's work has also appeared in group shows in Buenos Aires, across the US and throughout Europe, in venues such as the Julie Soul Gallery in New York City, the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts, and the National Portrait Gallery in London. Her international reputation is evident from the list of awards, grants, and residencies she's garnered from various foundations, universities, and other organizations, including the Jerome Foundation, the John Anson Kittredge Fund, and the Spanish Ministry of Culture. Her work has also been recognized in portrait competitions at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and most recently in the Hellerau Portrait Competition in Dresden, Germany. Yolanda Del Plomo is currently Associate Professor of Photography and Digital Media at Ramapo College in Mahwah, New Jersey. And in just a few minutes, I've asked both of the artists to say just a bit about their work and show you the work that they have in this exhibition, in case you haven't been able to make it there yet to the museum. Eddy Lopez was born in Nicaragua during the Sandinista Revolution and emigrated as a child to the United States. He studied painting, printmaking, and art history at Florida International University and received his MFA in printmaking from the University of Miami. Lopez's art has appeared in group exhibitions at galleries, museums, and other venues in Colombia, Egypt, Spain, and the United States. Next month, in fact, it'll appear in the 3rd printmaking biennial at the Central Academy of Fine Arts Museum in Beijing, China. His recent solo exhibitions include Beautiful War at the Samek Art Museum in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, Remixes at the Van Diver Gallery in Anderson, South Carolina, and Composites at the Maddie Kelly Art Center Gallery in Niceville, Florida. His work has also been exhibited at the International Print Center in New York, the North American Print Biennial, Art Miami, Art Palm Beach, and can be found in collections at the Frost Art Museum, Jaffe Center for Book Arts, Miami-Dade County Public Library, Zuckerman Museum of Art, Alminia University in Cairo, and more. He's the recipient of various awards and grants and was recently selected as an Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellow. Currently, Eddy Lopez is Assistant Professor of Art at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And so welcome to both of you. It's really, really a pleasure to have met you and also to be able to talk with you about your work. So why don't I go ahead and turn it over to each of you. Yolanda, if you want to start and show us a bit of your work, and then we'll move on to Eddy before we get to the questions.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Heide and Josephine, for the invitation tonight to this panel, and also for the invitation to the exhibition. I was very happy, very honored that my work was selected to be part of this exhibition, and I think this is a great forum to exchange ideas, and I appreciate all what went into preparing this panel and also the show, and it has been a real pleasure to work with all of you at NIU. So I'm going to share my screen. So I will provide a little bit of context for the work that you will see in this particular exhibition, and I will not talk about all my bodies of work, but just the bodies of work that are relevant to the work that is part of the body of work Refuge. So I am an artist and I work in photography. The through line of my work is the exploration of interpersonal relationships in contemporary society, ranging from the private to the socio-political. The tension between our everyday reality and our inner reality, and how we live with ourselves and others are the driving forces in my work. I question how social constructs such as class, gender, and family influence community, interpersonal psychology, and identity. Using real life as raw material, I honor the tradition of tableau or staged photography to deconstruct the relationship of individuals to one another and to society. With my own experience of cultural dislocation, I am sensitive to how society is formed by history, and I aim to represent relationships in ways that challenge our expectations. My most significant body of work is called Archipelago, and it is a body of work that I developed over a period of 10 years. And it is a project of large-scale tableau or staged photographs that explore the connections and disconnections between individuals and how the spaces they inhabit become a psychological extension of themselves. So I just have a few images that I will cycle through while I speak. Using friends or family as sitters, I drew inspiration from real life. I used my observations of them and their environment as raw material and added a theatrical dimension through my directorial approach. And this is the monograph that Heidi was talking about. It will be published in 2022. It was supposed to come out last year, but of course, COVID delayed it. So hopefully, fingers crossed, next year. And the images are printed large. And this is important for my work because I want the viewer to have an experience of the space and to enter the spaces that I portray. So this is an installation view of this particular body of work, Archipelago. So Refuge is the body of work that is where the 3 photographs belong to that are currently on view. And I have a few other images that are not in the show, not many, but the very last ones that I will show are the ones that are in your museum on display right now, but I will give you a little bit more context about this project. Refuge provides a counterpoint to the us versus them narrative by focusing on the integration of refugees in Germany after the massive influx in 2015, a phenomenon that polarized German society. I portrayed Germans and refugees who lived together under one roof, foster families who had taken in a minor, couples who were in romantic relationships, and flats shared by roommates, refugees, and native Germans. Rather than looking at otherness, Refuge emphasizes togetherness of the individuals who learn from each other within intimate spaces beyond public view. In these mixed habitats, Germans and migrants agree to share a home and negotiate their differences in habits, food, culture, and religion. As a photographer, I position myself at eye level with my collaborators, moving away from a top-down, potentially voyeuristic and exploitative approach. I consider them participants rather than passive subjects, and I invite them in the process of creation by folding their stories into the narrative of the images. I shoot with a large format camera and a format that is rare, and also it makes the process interesting for the participants. So this image, the previous image was an elderly lady who was sharing a home, her home with a Syrian refugee. These are 2 roommates who were sharing an apartment, and these are the 3 images that are currently on display. So I don't want to say too much about the pictures because I want to leave room for Heide's questions and then perhaps just elaborate more on them as the questions come up. But this is a family. This is a refugee who met a mother of 2, and they together they fell in love and they had a baby together. So they are now a family. The previous one was an apartment where the two young women took in this refugee. And this last picture is a family, a couple who took in a foster child when he was very young, who entered Germany, and they became foster parents and they became a family together. So this is all I have, and I look forward to then talking more about the work.
Thank you, Yolanda. So Eddy, why don't we move on to your work and discussion? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Heidi. Thanks, Yolanda, also for sharing your work. Thank you, Joe, Peter, and NIU for inviting me to be part of the exhibition, and also, of course, to be here with you all to talk a little bit about my work. And I'm really looking forward to engaging in the discussion and the questions that we've been thinking about. So I'll share my screen now and share with you, similar to Yolanda, just a little bit about what my work is about, a bit of why I do it, and then through the discussion, of course, we will further engage and discuss the pieces. So I'm a printmaker as an artist, as Heidi was discussing what I do. And in my work, I amalgamate archives and memories of war into abstractions of vibrant colors, patterns, and shapes. Through wide-scale collages, I'm using print media, as well as big data, averaging algorithms, and traditional printmaking techniques to create these compositions that try to find meaning in the chaos of conflict and war. As a survivor of war and a war refugee, I explore the relationship between lived experience and representation, between remembering and forgetting. Right. So, and I use the printmaking process through these composite prints, where I'm using multiple images, multiple layers, to build up these images, like the one you saw in the frontispiece, that seem to be a big mess. It's just an abstracted piece, however, built out of representations of war. Again, conceptually, the ideas that I'm working on, I'm essentially searching for the proper artistic response to pain and suffering, and interrogate also whether is it right to use this as a source for the creation of artwork. And in a way, I'm seeing the artistic process, the creation process, as a way to deal with some of the trauma of war and the victims and the refugees that are displaced from that. I use the art as a way to kind of find healing in that process. I do this, of course, because I myself, I'm a war refugee. As Yolanda was mentioning before, I'm from Nicaragua, and I was born into the Sandinista revolution and the civil war that followed into the 1980s. And I became an undocumented migrant to this country, accepted as a war refugee. My sister shared this with me actually this summer, as we were building a case for a relative who just this past March was also a war refugee. My home country has had a rather conflicted history. Ironically, it's called the land of lakes and volcanoes for these beautiful landscapes. And in this photograph by Susan Maeseles, in the background, you see that beautiful landscape, the mountains, the volcanoes, the lake. But in the foreground, of course, is the trauma and the violence of war. This is La Cuesta del Plomo, which was used by the henchmen of the dictator Anastasio Somoza to annihilate and kill anybody that stood against his rule. I was a child as all this was happening, and as the Sandinista revolution went through the streets of my hometown, and then of course the subsequent Contra war, civil war, all of these experiences shaped me as a child, as an adult, and as an artist. And recent experiences as well. Nicaragua, unfortunately, is also undergoing once again conflict. In 2018, uprisings occurred against the government that forced once again a huge displacement of Nicaraguans, where in the 1980s, hundreds of thousands sought refuge in Costa Rica, Honduras, Salvador, Mexico, and the United States. We're now once again seeing that as a result of the oppression from the current Ortega regime. So here's another Maeseles shot, in this case featuring a refugee. Among the things that I try to do with my work is how to make sense of this, how to make sense of the experience, how to make sense of the imagery, and question, interrogate, is it right to take these images, and why do we record these things, right? Because there is, of course, the risk of of re-traumatizing the individuals who are, survive and therefore and then have to engage these images. How do I create the work? And then like Yolanda, I'll just show you a few samples, and then we'll be discussing further as we break into a discussion. Susan Maeseles is known as the premier photojournalist that chronicled the Nicaraguan Civil War and Revolution. Her book, Nicaragua, is a masterpiece of photojournalism. When I look at this book, not only am I looking at this amazing body of work from a photojournalistic perspective, but I also see my hometown, right? I also see streets that I know. And what I then do is I go through these archives, I go through these books, I find this content, these photographs, I compile them all, I scan them, and then through the use of printmaking techniques, through the use of computer algorithms, I combine those images into the abstracted landscapes that you see. In the show, you'll see the piece here. This is, by the way, just a show and tell. But then these images become these obfuscated landscapes. I'll show you some of the pieces that are in the exhibition currently. This one is a Memoria Gráfica to 2019. And this one is La Prensa, Resistencia Ciudadana. This one is made from covers of La Prensa, the main Nicaraguan newspaper, covering the uprisings of 2018. And then another thing that another piece that's in the show that deals with my refugee experience is, of course, the duality of the refugees fleeing from one land to another. And what does that mean? Sorry, let me see if I can move forward to that one. Here we are. What does it mean, right, to exist in two places, in two nationalities, if you will? So I'll stop sharing here, but my work again is composite printing and dealing with really the representations of refuge and refugee.
Thank you, Eddy. Thank you both. I mean, both of these were very brief, but really impactful overviews of your work. And so I would like to actually share an image to get the conversation going. This is one of the exhibition rooms at the NIU Art Museum. And what you see here then is Yolanda's piece, Refuge number 14, here on the left. And you see Eddy's piece here on the right. That is Memoria Gráfica here. And then in the back is a triptych by Kathy Weaver. And I was really struck by this. So first of all, thanks to Peter Olsen, because he brought already these images in conversation with each other. And when I entered this room, when I first saw the exhibition, I was really thrilled that these two pieces were across from each other, because I had already decided that I wanted to speak to both Yolanda and Eddy about their work. I was struck by the fact that they have similar scale, that I was really kind of struck by the fact that color seems to be very important to them as well. But otherwise, they're so different from each other, right? And so that to me was part of the fascination. And I should say my entree into this is really through the lens of humanitarian photography, trying to understand the historical emergence of the genre, trying to figure out how photography had been used for humanitarian purposes. And of course, there were related genres as well, as Eddy just mentioned, war photography, right? Photojournalism focused on violence and war. you know, trying to think through how have these things been represented. We just need to look at our news feeds to be aware of all of the refugee crises that are going on, whether we look to our southern border, whether we look to Europe, you know, and again, there was just a boatload of hundreds of migrants and refugees from Africa that left from Libya the other day, right? So I mean, it's kind of the constant background of news that kind of peeks through every once in a while in the United States when we're not paying attention to COVID pandemic or something else. And so, you know, what really struck me then about both of your work was the fact that you seem to be taking on these conventional depictions, right? These depictions that have gained traction in the media for over 100 years, right? That really focuses on, you know, just to use some of your own words, othering, right? That these are basically images that are presented for the edification sometimes and the consumption of distant audiences that are distant from the events and distant from the suffering. And nonetheless, these images present suffering, present vulnerable people on the move, present people at their worst, at their neediest. And, you know, and so there is, and there has, of course, been, you know, a relatively, well, I wouldn't say that long discussion, but at least since the late 1970s, early 1980s, but there's been a pretty focused discussion about the ethics of representation. And so your work really, to me, seems to defy these or challenge and defy these conventions of depiction. And yet they're so different from each other. Yolanda, as she talked about, space is important to her, staging is important to her, social dynamics, it seems like also psychological dynamics she's mentioned for her work are important. And it is clearly representational. I also wonder, is it idealized? I don't know. It's, you know, it's questions I have when looking at your work, Yolanda. For Eddy, I mean, it's abstract. But shockingly to me, when I entered this room and looked at your piece here, Eddy, was that I was expecting something else. And I really felt an emotion that, you know, was shocking to me. And that is that there is something that's, I don't know, soothing, pleasant. I mean, the opposite of what I would have expected, right? Given the theme, given the topic in a sense. And so, you know, I'm curious about things like emotion, how that gets mobilized, whether you consider your work actually to be, I mean, you talk about abstract landscapes and so forth, but whether you consider it to be non-representational, because you are in fact using actual images, right, that get fed into this and create something different. You're transforming those images. I can't quite make out, you know, what's going on there. There's no figural representation that I can make out all that well. There's maybe a little building, but it's still, it's not clear to me that non-representational is the right term for your work. And so these are some of the things that I'm thinking about when I look at your work. I think both of you said a bit about how you came to your topics and a bit about your processes. But I wonder if there's anything that you want to add, you know, about those topics to kind of build on. And if not, we can, you know, I've got other questions that we can move on to. So why don't I just turn it over to you and see if you have any responses at this point.
Shall I start, or do you want to jump in, Eddy?
I'll go for it, Yolanda, please.
I'm sorry?
I'll go for it, please.
Oh, okay. So I was doing this kind of stage work before, interested, like I said, in these interactions between individuals, how society and the constructs of society can be perhaps deconstructed. And that brought me really to the idea or to the approach of using constructed photography. So I am very, very deliberate why I use this form of photography and not any other, right? Any other approach. And I have a background in, like Heide mentioned, I have a history with Germany. I grew up in Madrid. I am Spanish born, but I went to a German school growing up. So I was brought up speaking German and Spanish, and it was a relatively natural thing to do to move to Germany. At that time, I was born when Franco was still alive. And so during those years, I grew up in a family that was a little bit of an intellectual family. And so in those years, it wasn't so uncommon to attend an international school. Those were considered a little bit more open-minded and so forth. So that's why, even though coming from a Spanish background, I ended up having this very German experience from very little. So I had many years living in Germany. I worked for a German corporation as a mathematician, in fact, and so I have all this connection, and of course many friends in Germany. And then when the big influx into 2015 was happening, and I was watching the news and the media, and I was also living it through my friends, and they were telling me how palpable it was everywhere, because the numbers were just incredible, right? More than 1 million refugees entered Germany. I mean, that's something that, if you compare it to the numbers here, even though the current administration is trying to raise those numbers of accepted refugees, right? They're just not in the same proportion. So everybody was talking about it. And I really was really struck by the images that we saw of undifferentiated masses of people. There was no individuality, suffering, and I wanted to see what were these people experiencing. And also I was very inspired by the reaction of solidarity. It was a phenomenon that really polarized the society, right? It was a very negative reaction on one side, a lot of fear, really, of just racism also, and just how are we gonna deal with all these people in our country. But there was also a very, very positive, very generous response of all these Germans who were taking in refugees, and there were these help groups and nonprofit organizations doing work and really going out of their way in ways that were just incredible. So I was watching all this evolving through the media and my friends, and then I thought I would like to add a dimension to my work that is more socio-political. That was something that I had been meaning to do, but I just hadn't found the topic that felt right. And I always wanted to find a topic that made sense to me, where I just felt I was not completely coming from the outside. And then so I took a first trip in 2017 in the summer, and I just really showed up in Berlin and to see what I could do. And I'm not a big social media person, but I through social media was able to connect with some families, and they were the first connections that I made. And then word of mouth, it started growing, and then they were just referring me to other people and other mixed households. And then not until 2 years later, I was able to go back with a sabbatical, and that's how I was able to do the big chunk of the work that I was actually I was thinking of continuing it, then COVID hit, and now things have changed since that time very much. So I don't think the German part of the project is going to continue anymore. And I have about 18 photographs, so I consider that a body of work that is complete.
Can you just, before we turn to Eddy, could you just say a bit about your process? So once you learned of these families or got introduced to these families and these groups, I mean, it seems to me that you talk about space and scale of your photography, but also the space that you're showing is kind of intimate domestic space, right? It's not the public space that we're used to seeing when we look at refugees, right? Who are usually outdoors and so forth. So I'm wondering, since you talked about being at eye level with the people that you're photographing, how that works. I mean, how do you negotiate that?
Yeah, so once I connected to a family or mixed household or a flat where several roommates were living together, I introduced myself and I just explained that in the early stages it was harder because I had nothing to show. I had no photographs that I could show, or I had no references. Whereas I was shooting more and more, I could say, you can talk to this person and they can tell you about their experience. But early on, they really needed to trust me initially. And then I had preliminary conversations that lasted hours often. Especially, for example, the early ones, as time was passing, the refugees who had all come in 2015, they started learning German better, but early on, some of them didn't really speak that well. So even communicating was not that easy at the beginning, but we found a way to talk and to communicate. And then I will ask them very candid questions, how they found each other, what was the motivation for the German part to host them. I mean, if they had a room, they would have subsidy from the city or from the government. So instead of renting it to a stranger, they just decided to take in a refugee. And then the refugee, they said why they wanted to move in, right? Not everybody was open for that. They just rather stayed in their shelter. It was too foreign. They were afraid. Some of them were afraid they couldn't practice, right, their religious rituals. I mean, not everybody was open also for that to make that move. And so lots of talking, and sometimes it was very moving because in that moment, they shared things that maybe they hadn't even shared with one another before, because they had done more of a bureaucratic, like the paperwork, and yes, you move in, and maybe the refugee didn't speak very well. And then I came in, and then I provided that opportunity. So sometimes they said, oh, I didn't even know that. And so it was very beautiful. And then I always asked the question what they had learned from one another in that experience. People had to really think about it. And it was just beautiful how what things came out of those conversations. I never took notes while I was there. I never was there with a notebook. I never recorded. I wanted it to be relaxed, and I didn't want them to feel interviewed. But as soon as I got home, I wrote everything down that I could remember. I was very sensitive to the fact that a lot of them shared with me that they had experiences with, for example, whole TV crews showing up and record and filming, and then they never knew what happened to that footage. They just never heard back from those people. And I thought it was terrible. And they always said, what do I get from this experience? Just offering my time. They were busy. They were in language school. They had jobs. They were in training. So I also wanted to really make them feel respected, and that they also were collaborators. So this is where I want to get to. So for me, I didn't come with a fixed idea of what I wanted to do with them. I wanted to hear first their story, and then what were those experiences that they had together, what were the common things they like to do with one another. And then that was those details, I folded them into the pictures. I can tell just like a small little anecdote about the garden picture, for example. it's a house out in a neighborhood in Berlin, Karlshorst, that was part of the East. And in their garden, I mean, it was just really a crazy coincidence that they had a stone, and in that stone was an antenna mast where after the Second World War, they broadcasted that Germany had surrendered from the Second World War. They broadcasted the capitulation from that garden. I mean, it just happened to be that way very randomly. And so the stone was nothing special, but then when we were thinking about where to do the photo, and the stone symbolized peace, and then we really wanted them, both of them, sitting in that stone. So the whole photograph revolved around that stone. And then we wanted to do it with a rose bush, and then it was blossoming, and then they got busy. And so some things happened just a little bit by coincidence. In the time of the year, it was planned in the spring, but we couldn't do it until later, and so forth, right? I had to work with people's schedules and so forth. But what they told me always became part of the picture.
So it sounds like there was also serendipity there with the broadcast in the stone. I mean, that's
exactly.
kind of amazing.
Yes.
But I think also, you know, what this reminds us of is the fact that, you know, your relationship then, it's a social relationship, it's a social interaction, and it can have impact then too. I mean, when you talk about the stories that people tell you and that they learn about other, you know, their own stories, the people living in this space together. So that's wonderful. And I think that's also an important reminder that the photographer is there in person. Often as viewers, we just kind of see that and forget photographers disappear, right? And we forget that they exist, but it's so important. And you underline that with, you know, with your discussion about the process. Eddy, you're coming at this, of course, from an insider's perspective, from somebody with the experience. And so I wonder if you want to reflect on that and, you know, what you're doing in your art and how that works, because clearly your art is much different. And actually engaging with different issues too, right? I mean, I want to eventually ask both of you about who your art is for, the audience and so forth. But if you would reflect on your process a bit, that would be great.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Heidi. And, you know, in many ways, I think the way you framed the opening of this discussion when you showed the layout of the exhibition, I think it's so fantastic to see, you know, Yolanda's piece with my piece in conversation, because even though we're very different in the way we're doing it, we're both kind of, you know, refusing, negating those traditional representations of pain and suffering of refugees and victims of war. And we just come across it to that in very, very different ways. Obviously, as you mentioned, I do have an insider's perspective to it. You know, I grew up into a revolution. I grew up in a war. I went through the experience of, you know, seeking refuge in another country. And, you know, obviously I'm an artist, and I came to understanding that I came to this series through many years. Since I was a child, I understood the fact that art could be used to tackle social issues. So I grew up reading the poetry of people like Ernesto Cardenal, Gioconda Belli, who were revolutionary poets. I listened to the music of Carlos Mejia Godoy, you know, who, again, these were Nicaraguan artists and musicians that were crafting music that dealt with the experiences of the revolution and war. So, you know, when I was in undergrad, this was in the early 2000s. I'm in the US already. I've settled. I'm a resident. And what struck me at that point, when the war in Afghanistan started, incredibly 20 years ago, and just now, unfortunately, ending in such an unfortunate fashion and creating another refugee crisis. What struck me then, when the war in Afghanistan started and the Iraq war started, was the way in which I was experiencing war in a country that saw it as kind of like a spectacle. Because the truth is that the majority of American citizens, aside from being affected in, you know, the rising gas prices, most US citizens did not experience war the way that the soldiers and, of course, the people affected in Iraq and Afghanistan did. And that just struck me when I would watch those feeds on CNN, when I would watch the feeds on, I think I would just watch CNN. I was gonna say Fox News, but no, I don't think I've ever watched Fox News. So that it struck me as this, just the disconnection there. So I did pieces through those years that dealt with that idea of, lived experience, representation, the spectacle of it in this country. And then the series that I present now, I started back in about 2014, 2013. At that point, I had already been doing these composite prints, and I had done different projects with that. And, it came to a point where I just wanted to introspect and really go and connect with who I am, which is a Nicaraguan American who is a war refugee. And it just made sense to then start looking into the archives, books, and photographs of the Nicaraguan War and Revolution. So I did begin with Susan Maeseles. I started looking at the work of foreign journalists that were embedded in Nicaragua in the 80s and 70s, William Gentile and James Nachtwey. There's a number of different foreign journalists working in Nicaragua. So I did a series of that. And then I was able to, I realized that I was looking at foreigners, looking at my home country. So I started doing trips into Nicaragua and going to archives in Nicaragua that house Nicaraguan journalists and Nicaraguan photojournalists and their experiences of the war. Because I felt that then, if it had been me in Nicaragua in the 80s, those would have been my memories, or closer to the memories that I had as a child. So I was able to go to the Universidad Centroamericana, the UCA in Managua, the capital, and I was able to access archives of newspapers and journalists who were working for La Prensa and working for Barricada and all the other newspapers that were of that time in the 80s. So I started the project, and it had always been distant, right? It had always been, okay, this is something that happened in the 70s and 80s. And as I'm working on this project in 2018, the uprisings occur in Nicaragua, and that just creates an entirely new crisis that, again, leads to a lot of deaths, unfortunately, and another refugee crisis. And then so I go back in 2019 after this, and it's just such a different experience at that point. It made me question my whole enterprise, and it made me really start thinking more about, whereas before I was doing, I guess, that project that was a little more historical, this became relevant. I mean, this became about now. And I would go in, scan images, papers, and then take them back to my studio and create pieces and work as a result of that.
So I wonder, that is really helpful in terms of your personal connection. I'm wondering, though, if you could pull up one of the prints and talk a little bit about the alchemy involved, because you're feeding in these images, these made images, these photographs that were taken by photojournalists and others, presumably, and you're outputting something that's completely different. And, so I wonder, could you just maybe show us one of them and talk a little bit about it? And I guess also reflect on who you're doing this for. I mean, it sounds like it's very personal on the one hand, as all art tends to be, right? And I have a sense of that, but I do wonder, who do you see as your audience, aside from the museum goer? Are you speaking to other Nicaraguans? Is this, and that I'd really be fascinated to hear a bit about.
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to. So I'll share my screen now, and let's see, here is my PowerPoint. All right, can you all see that? And I'll jump over to this one. I know I skipped to them before. So these are some of the images that made up the Memoria Gráfica, the one that's at the museum in front of Yolanda's piece. And all of these are images from the uprisings that occurred in April of 2018, and it went for about 6 months. And these are all by Nicaraguan photojournalists. And what I would do is, again, scan them for these images. I was at La UCA, and I went in and photographed each of the images. I spoke to the directors of the UCA and the journalists and to ask for permission. I said, okay, if I use these images for the way that I'm going to, and then from these images, I scan them all and I run in what's called an averaging algorithm that just takes all those photographs and then kind of churns out an image like this. I do manipulate for color and I do manipulate for some contrast so that out of all those images, I pull an aesthetically pleasing image. So Heidi, you brought up that issue that, the image brought out all these emotions. So, I do have a background in abstract painting. I obviously I've got an affinity for that type of work. So yes, in some ways this is from that tradition, but conceptually, I mean, it's just completely different. So that's how this particular piece was built, from images of the uprisings in 2018. Here's the other piece that's at the show, which is the covers of La Prensa. So La Prensa was covering the uprisings in 2018, featuring, Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, you do see images of bloodied people and, of course, bodies and so forth. And all of these, once again, get I pass them through the algorithm, which yielded the image. Well, this is just a dramatization, the image that's also at the exhibition. Now, I do combine multiple printmaking processes in these. So it's digital, it's silkscreen, in some cases lithography, to help me, pull colors and build the aesthetic object that you see. One thing to note here is that, La Prensa, for example, because of the fact that it's been standing up to the oppression of the Ortega regime, it's currently closed, right? Its newspaper is shut down. The government has taken over the headquarters and they can only publish online, or because the government can't find the journalists as they're scattered around the country. Who is this for? I mean, definitely this is a reflective piece for myself. But I think it's also work that I create to help the audience that sees it reflect. In one of the, as you were reading, my CV, my bio, you mentioned one of the shows that I had in Niceville. So that was actually at a university that serves an Air Force base. So what was interesting about that one is that there were a lot of soldiers and the kids of soldiers that were taking courses and saw the exhibition, and they connected to it. They said that these were very emotional works, even though they're abstract, right? But they felt that to them it sort of helped them connect to the fog of war, to the fog of the experience of a hectic space, like a conflict zone, but at the same time, of course, it was also a pleasing image, right? So I think that it helped me understand the fact that these could be images that could be seen as a way to take all of that pain and suffering and kind of try to transform it. So I'd say it's for individuals who have experienced it, also for I don't want to say that it's a teachable piece. I think that Susan Sontag kind of talks about the impossibility of understanding, something like a war or a war zone. But it's my hope is that it can lead to compassion and lead to some sort of an empathic moment for somebody who has never gone through this, and understand that the victims of war and refugees, say we need to welcome them, if you will, to this country. So I'll stop the share.
Thank you, Eddy. That was really useful. So I also want to invite both of you to speak to each other rather than just through me. I guess I have one other question that I'd like to pose to maybe Yolanda, and I guess two things actually, just to follow on what Eddy was talking about, emotion and empathy and so forth. Is that something, Yolanda, that you're after in your work? Or, I guess another way of saying it is, what sort of viewer are you hoping that your work will produce? Since both of you are explicitly working against, again, these kind of more conventional depictions that we've become, too familiar with over the decades.
I use stage photography, like I said before, to question these social constructs. And I want to reference Brecht, because I actually use his as a motivation, or as an inspiration. His theory, the distancing theory, right? Brecht, the German playwright of the East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, who said that if you break the illusion in the theater by, for example, just putting signs, or just having the actors talk to the audience, or basically breaking the illusion that you're watching something that is a narrative that is evolving, right? Just making people aware in the audience that it is fabricated, right? It is a theatrical piece. So it's not, you're not really drawn into the story too much, because you're constantly reminded that there's a stage director there, and those are just actors, and so forth. So I take that idea and I apply that to my photos, in the sense that everything is clearly staged, right? Things are very meticulously composed, things are in place. It's clearly that it's not candid, just because how the composition looks like. And so I want to use that also as a tool, like Brecht, who said, if I make the audience aware that they just watching something that is a fabrication, then I make them active participants, and I make them ask questions about what they're watching. If they just only believe the story, then they're drawn to the story, and I lose them. But if I make them aware that they are just watching something that has been created, then I make them more active, and I invite them to raise questions. So this is what I want also. Photography, we can talk about photography as being a window perhaps into the world, right? And so I want both, right? So I want images that we were talking about, Heidi, before, about perhaps idealizing. So yes, I want to use beauty. I mean, Eddy was also talking about that, right? Just that tension between something very beautiful and very seductive, and then something, and then the meaning that is under that, right? That is just on the surface, very, just brings you in, but then actually it has, there's depth, right? And there's content. And so I am interested in that tension, right? Between just the formal look and the seductiveness of the piece, and then what is actually the piece is saying. So I'm interested in addressing viewers in that way, right? I'm bringing them in. I'm not interested in shocking, and I would do different images. I would do images that were perhaps more documentary, traditional documentary style. So I'm interested in making pretty images, but as a strategy, really, right? I mean, I want things, I love beautiful images to look at, but I also want to use that as a tool in this staging to raise these questions. And I want to address viewers that are everywhere. So some of these pieces were in public spaces. I am really moving away from wanting the show to be only in a gallery or museum setting. I really want the work to function in different ways. For example, in Berlin, I photographed a former nursing home that had been converted into a facility where refugees and Germans lived. The rooms were rented out, and I shot on the roof of that facility, and they're using it for their fundraising campaign, which I think is wonderful. And I would have never thought about that earlier. But so I am interested in using these images as a tool to hopefully also convey and depict a world that is inclusive, that is a world of tolerance, and to activate that in the viewers in a way that it's not in their faces immediately, right? That they maybe not see right away that this is a situation between a refugee and a German, and sometimes maybe you don't even, it's like, who is the refugee, right? In these pictures, who is who, which is exactly what I want, right? That you actually start looking and asking questions.
Okay, that's a wonderful answer. I mean, and I'm happy that you are also influenced by Brecht and his theories. I mean, that's great. And it also means that what you wanted people to do is to kind of step back and understand and look closely, right? And as you say, enter the space because it's large format, but on the other hand, look around and start thinking about it. And so that's fascinating about kind of, so it's kind of a balance between intellect and emotion, right? And, I go back to, of course, the conventional depictions, and it's all about emotion, right? It's all about revulsion or pity or things like that. And so kind of creating this space to contemplate, which I think both of your works do, but in much different ways, is really important and fascinating as well. So we're at about an hour now. I'm wondering whether others want to chime in with questions. Let me take a look at either if people want to unmute and ask a question or type a question into chat. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Me? Yes, go ahead, please.
I was wondering, this might be a sensitive question, but I was wondering, what is the difference between a migrant and a refugee? Because we hear those terms a lot on the news, but the news people never really explain who they are. So I hope that makes sense.
Sure.
Okay.
Would
Thank
you take a crack at that? I'm happy to. So, Hannah, thanks for the question. This summer I was at a artist residency in Albuquerque, and one of the other artists there was a Syrian immigrant, right? An artist who had migrated from Syria as a result of the war in Syria. And we got to talking, and she told me, I'm an immigrant that sought political asylum. And, I saw her as a refugee too, but she was like, there is a difference between the two of us. You're a war refugee, I'm a political asylum, I have an asylum, but we're both immigrants, right? So an immigrant would be just somebody who is moving from one place to another. Some of them move from one place to another. Right? I have friends who are artists who said, I want to move to the United States because I want to go work in Hollywood. And they're just seeking an opportunity to go work in a place where they like. So the immigrant phrase would be just somebody who's just moving from one, again, place to another. And then I would say then if we start looking at refugees, people that seek political asylum, then we're then seeing individuals who are forced to seek refuge from wherever they are. In my case, my family, my parents separated my family. I was 9 years old, traveling with my sister who was in her 20s. And they separated our family of a large Catholic family of 8 because they were afraid for our lives. So they forced us to, we were forced to make the trek through Mexico and the border as a result of the war. So it's like the choice, right? We sought refuge elsewhere because due to a desperate situation. And I would say it's the same reason when we think of who a refugee is, looking at the images of the refugees out of Afghanistan, what makes someone seek refuge is a really, really dire situation. And when I talk to folks, to my students here, for example, I say, what would it take for you to try to cling on to the wings of an airplane as it's taking off? What kind of situation would force you to do that, or to migrate from one place to another? That I think is what a refugee is about, right? And then so an immigrant is just somebody who is moving from one place to another. Refugee is somebody who is being forced to move from one place to another.
Can I add something to the use of that term, because Eddy explained it very, very, very clearly and very eloquently. So when I was doing this project in Germany, some refugees did not want to be called refugees. So the term, because they didn't want to be labeled as such. So for example, in Germany now, a lot of people would say somebody with a migration background, right? So that became kind of the phrase. And a lot of the people I asked, I mean, I had very many positive responses and I was able to do my photos, but some of them said, I don't want to participate because I don't want anything that labels me as a refugee. So they just they saw themselves as citizens in the new society. And I don't know, Eddy, if you can relate to this at all, but there's also something related with the stigma, right? That kind of label can have.
Yeah, I think it comes from, I guess, the position of in life that you're in, right? If you're a very recent refugee and you're seeking to somehow find a home and I don't want to say assimilate, but just be in a place where you're safe, having a label that might carry a negative connotation or might put you in trouble in that new home is not something you're going to want. I am very comfortable calling myself a refugee now because, well, I've been in this country for decades now, and I think that I find it necessary to advocate for refugees and advocate with my work and so on. So yes, in my history, I was a war refugee, but I'm at a place now where I'm a U.S. citizen. I've made a home here, whereas somebody who may have just crossed the border a few months ago may not want to be claiming the fact that they are a refugee. Right. So I saw, Hannah, you mentioned the idea of depends that it depends that the term that each person prefers. To an extent, when I spoke to the Syrian artist, she mentioned the fact that she didn't see herself as a refugee, right? But in my mind, she is, right? She sought political asylum in the United States because she couldn't go back home to Syria.
I think what you're hearing then is people who are responding to the kind of pejorative associations that have been layered onto the term refugee. And I think it's absolutely true that refugees are people who are fleeing from something, right? There's a push factor there. It's often war. It's sometimes political oppression, combination of things, right? Or some other sort of man-made crisis often. Now, of course, we have climate refugees, and I guess we'll be seeing more of them, unfortunately, as well. But the point is that there's a push factor. I mean, I just want to add one other dimension. And so, of course, there, as we know, there have been, and there's a question about, how do other countries do in comparison to the US with accepting migrants? I mean, there have been historical periods where there's been openness and where there have been shut doors. And that's the case in this country. I mean, you can point to the 1920s where there were exclusionary laws that didn't get lifted for some groups, especially Asians and other groups, till the 1960s. But of course, now with these waves of migrants and the media coverage of our southern border, there's again anti-immigrant sentiment that we're all aware of, right? So people might decide that it's not in their best interest to identify or to label themselves as such for those reasons, right? That they don't want to become targets of hate, frankly. But I think it's also important to realize that there's an international legal history having to do with labeling refugees. And, the international community, there were refugee crises after World War I. There have been refugees much longer as well, but the international community and the League of Nations after World War I began dealing with refugees and figuring out things like nationality status and so forth, right? Once somebody leaves their homeland, what happens to them? Do they become completely without any rights? Because rights, of course, are connected to nations, right? That's how we get our rights as citizens of nations. And of course, after World War II, refugees got legally defined by the international community. And with the Cold War in the 1940s, from the United States perspective, we started labeling refugees as people who were subjected to political repression or oppression. And often our sights were on the Soviet Union, right, on post-war Europe and the Soviet Union. And so there is also a kind of legal definition of refugee. And at that point, of course, it was refugees who were allowed to claim asylum, right? We still are supposed to be offering asylum to refugees. And that, of course, has become a political hot potato and a form of debate. So that's just the historian in me who wanted to complicate the discussion a little bit more. But again, there are both national and international laws that help to define these various statuses as well. Okay, it looks like Kathy Bean has a question. I am struck by the contrast between Yolanda and Eddy's work. Yolanda puts the people in sharp, clear focus. Eddy blurs out the shocking images underneath. I have a sense of healing in each approach. Yolanda's as healing to the subjects of the portrait, Eddy's as healing to himself as an artist. Is there any validity to my impressions?
I would say, I mean, from my end, yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a great reading of my work.
Same with my work, absolutely. Absolutely, and it was a very healing process, both for the refugees and also for the host families. We all know German has a complicated history, right? So just having this very, generous gesture and wanting to, to change the image of Germany in the world was also something that they were really proud of. So that was healing on multiple levels, and they were very, very proud that they were getting along so well, and that they were able to share these households and just make dinner together. And so that was just a very very positive experience that they wanted, and that was also part of their motivation to participate in the project. The photo shootings took a long time. They were with extra light, so it wasn't that I just showed up and took a few snapshots. It was a real commitment on their end to really be part of it, and I think they really got that healing experience, or a little bit of that healing experience out of it. Good observation, Kathy.
Are there any other questions?
Can you folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Pete Olsen. I work with Josephine, and when I was arranging and installing the exhibition, I was kind of keenly aware of some of the connections between the artwork, and I noticed some other things that I just thought I would mention. One in particular, between Eddy's work and some of the other things in the exhibition, which we don't have images of, but that flag that we saw, the American and the Nicaraguan flags superimposed, the way we have hung it in the exhibition, it's vertical rather than horizontal, which makes the bars, the stripes in the flag seem like bars of a prison. And there are some images of prisons, and we all know about refugees and prison situations. And also the vertical bars in the border fence between the US and Mexico. There is some work in the exhibition that specifically focuses on that. And so there's other things in the exhibition that are kind of in dialogue with each other, besides just what we have looked at this evening. And I also wanted to mention something that I noticed in Yolanda's work. Since I sort of intuited that they were very carefully arranged and not just sort of documentary snapshots. You walk into a room and go, oh, this is super, and take a picture. They felt very they were kind of arranged, but not artificially. So, but one thing that I noticed, because everything in there does seem like it had some kind of meaning. The two pictures that are together, of the folks at the window and then the folks on the bed, there's also a door next to the folks on the bed into another room. And that could easily be cropped off in the photograph, but you chose to include it. And I find it interesting that both, and outside the window, there are trees. I don't want to, the word promised land sounds pretty cliched, but I did sense that possible layer of meaning with all the other layers. And certainly there are two spaces involved, with at least two in a refugee's journey from one place to another. And this was just to me like a little reminder below the surface of that double life, that double identity, living in two worlds simultaneously. And if I'm missing anything along those lines, if you want to fill that in for all of us, but I just wanted to add my 2 cents about that. Thank you.
Yolanda, could I just add one thing onto what Pete said? And that is, I was also kind of intrigued by the open door and so forth in the photo with the family on the bed. But I guess I interpret it a little bit differently. It almost seems like there's a narrative there, or there's drama there that it adds to the picture. And so I guess now I'm wondering, is there symbolism I should be seeing, or is it the kind of composition that's trying to, I don't know, an open door, there's just something that it creates some, I don't know if dynamism is the right word, but there's something, or some narrative tension or something. So I would be curious to hear you reflect a bit on that.
Well, I am very glad that you noticed that open door, because that shot was one of the first shots, and it was a very difficult to do for a photographer. A photographer would roll their eyes if I say that was shot with a large format camera, because having this very cumbersome camera and kids and dogs jumping around and just getting the shot and focusing, it's just not the right format to do that. So in order to include that door, and I typically don't do composites. I mean, I shoot the picture the way I want. It's not that I cut out people and then put them in a different background or anything. But if I don't get them in the shot in the moment, I take different takes, basically different shots, and then digitally composite them if I couldn't get it in one. And the door was one of those examples, because I knew that it was so chaotic when we were doing it that I was really not sure if anything came out of that. And after everybody had left, I said, I want to take a picture with the room in this open door, because I knew I wanted that open door. And I had to, in fact, digitally composite it so that it's part of the composition. Because initially the shot that I had, when it was not including that door, it felt too busy. There was not a room where that provided that other, that other dimension, that other space that you could breathe in. So I saw that open door as a metaphor for different possible things. So I don't have a specific explanation or a specific idea. I mean, very good observation, Pete, about just this other, right? This other door, this other opening. What was that novel? There was a novel about refugees not too long ago that where the characters opened a door, and that door brought them already into a different reality. I will email you that. I don't remember the title, but it was one of the first year seminar readings for my school a few years ago. And so anyway, so that door as a metaphor for another possibility, for another option. But just compositionally, and also the lighting, it needed a different balance. The lighting is very artificial on the people, and then it needed something that had more natural light, and it needed just some room to breathe from that very kind of dense and almost symbiotic relationship that the characters had developed, where all the pieces, one arm bleeds into the arm of the next person and so forth, and they're so concentrated. So that door really needed just that kind of escape for the viewer, for all those possibilities. I play a lot, and also in previous projects or images that I didn't show today, how you structure the image and the space in the image has a particular a purpose, right? So if, like I said, in an image like that, where it's just so concentrated in one, it just needs a different balance, psychologically and visually.
That's really interesting. You know, Eddy, I want to ask you a question. Jalen has posed a question about how do we think we can change minds of Americans on refugees, since most Americans never relate to a refugee. I mean, I wonder if you can, you know, if you have any thoughts about that in relation to your work and the effect that your work has, which I'm still fascinated about because it is abstract, you know, and yet it does seem to affect people, right? Even though they don't really know what they're looking at, right? And so I wonder if you can just think about that, reflect on that a bit.
Definitely. So when I exhibit them, also these pieces, I oftentimes also provide the books and the resources. So in a solo exhibition, for example, I'll have the pieces, and then there will be a number of the books there, like the Maeseles book, the one by Gentile, and others. So I you know, viewers are invited to look through the book in a way. So if you want to see the source images and see that experience, and obviously there's always the statements about the pieces, the descriptive information about them. So if somebody is, you know, Yolanda was talking about how we use beauty to kind of build these images that are aesthetically pleasing to look at. And I like to think of them as kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? So it's like this really beautiful object that you're looking at, but when you get up close and you start reading about them, you reveal them, you realize that, you know, there's something in there that's much more impactful, right? That so in terms of you know, they definitely impact. I think from the exhibitions I've had, you know, the audience does come away with and somewhat of an understanding of, you know, where the work is coming from. And my hope is that in that understanding, there's a building of empathy, right? Even though, and I know the question was from Jalen about, you know, how do we reach others? You know, how do you win hearts and minds? You know, it's through work like what Yolanda's doing, what I'm doing. I think it also, unfortunately, also means that we need to show the images of what's causing refugees to go. And you know, I mentioned the Susan Sontag text Susan Sontag before, in regarding the pain of others, where she where she talks about the enterprise of photojournalism and the depictions of war and suffering and refugees and victims of war. You know, I again, as somebody who went through that, I think it is necessary to kind of use some of these images to show what has happened and what's causing some, you know, for example, again, the refugees out of Afghanistan coming out, that horrible image of that, you know, young man falling off the plane as the plane is taking off. It's horrific. It's something that, you know, I want to see once and never again. But it's in the hope of understanding what is causing these people to flee, right? To seek it, to be pushed away from their homeland. I think the media in that sense plays an important role, but it has to be very sensible as to how those images are used. And you know, it is a spectacle at times. It is something that I feel like it needs to be treated with a level of respect that, you know, it can be used to inform and build support for, you know, the causes of you know, of aid towards refugees. it's a delicate balance. You know, at times, sometimes I question it. I think, is this really necessary? But if the images weren't there, I think the result would be worse, right? So it's kind of like this, the lesser of two evils.
Thank you. So I feel, part of me feels like I want another hour, and I would love to talk to both of you about your work and kind of get into the nitty gritty. I have all sorts of questions about the work itself. But I think that, you know, it's been a wonderful conversation. And I'd like to thank you both, Yolanda Del Amo and Eddy Lopez, also Josephine Burke for organizing this for us, and of course, Peter Olsen for curating the exhibit. Thanks too to those of you who came to the talk today. If you haven't yet gone to the exhibit, I very much recommend it. And it's on campus. It's open Monday through Friday during business hours, and do stop by and see it. So Josephine, would you like to say a few words in conclusion?
I do. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists, Yolanda and Eddy, and our moderator, Heidi Fahrenbach. Really good discussion. And I want to thank the audience for your insightful observations and questions. The gallery, I should let you know, is open Tuesday, Wednesday from 10 until 1, Thursday, Friday from 12 until 6, and Saturday from 12 until 3. We do open as well extra hours if we can staff it for classes or groups. So if you have a group you can get together and want to come, if we can do it, we're happy to do so. Tomorrow's hybrid program, Living in Confinement, will feature NIU anthropology alumnus Carla Finley speaking with members of the Burmese Karen refugee community of Aurora. And next week, Associate Professor of Sociology and Nonprofit NGO Studies, Laura Heidemann, will provide perspective on the declining situation for refugees in the world today. So it may be that some of those conversations also will give you some more insight, like Jalen, to your question of how people might respond. One of the other programs that Carla's doing later is really talking with people in Aurora about how they've made these folks from Burma feel welcome, you know. And the final program in that series is with NIU students who grew up in refugee camps on the Thai-Burma border, talking about their experience and now being Asian Americans and living in DeKalb, being at NIU. What is that experience, as well as being refugees and, you know, living up to their folks' expectations and wanting to do right by them for, you know. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for these presentations. Updated links will soon be found on both the university and the museum's event calendars. And I want to again thank Heidi and Eddy and Yolanda and Pete. We hope that you have a good evening and good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pete, for all the work that went into this exhibition. Really has been a pleasure working with you. Thank you, Heidi, for this initiative of this panel. Like I said, thank you, Josephine, also for everything. And it was so wonderful to meet Eddy. I mean, to meet all of you, but to meet a fellow artist who is interested in similar ideas from a very different perspective. So I'm really inspired by your work, Eddy, and it just has been a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, everybody.
Ditto, thank you. This was awesome. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a
Bye.
good evening. Bye.
Another time, another hour.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.